awesome to be able to speak to you both because I'm such a huge fan of this series and just Daredevil in general, and it's been great to see the work you guys have done. And goes without saying, you already delivered a perfect take on that X-Men theme for one revival. But I'm curious to begin with, was it always the plan to bring back that Daredevil theme from Netflix? And were you given a lot of freedom to make it your own and that new spin that we do get, in the credits and throughout the series?
Well, first, let's just start by saying I love your background. All the action figures, all the wall, the shield in the back. It's great. Um, but yes, uh, we tried a lot of different options as we always do in the beginning to see sort of what was working, and the intention to sort of honor and continue from the original series. So we obviously wanted to bring back the theme and expand on it, and I think the real underlining thing was sort of the Matt Murdock of it all. Like, what is his theme? What's his journey in this story? And so we were able to play on that in the main titles and sort of hint on his theme as it continues. And I think that was the sort of the big thing.
Yeah, I think that like being fans ourselves, it was sort of a discussion at the get-go between Taylor and I of that theme needs, the original Paisanos theme needs to be in there. That is Daredevil. And then what is this new sort of journey we go on this season? Where do we need to take that musically and what does that mean? And as Taylor said, it was sort of finding out, who is Matt Murdock and what is that theme? And that sort of then informed like who sort of each of the, alter egos of everyone else there was out there and how we sort of approach that.
Awesome. And you talk about the alter egos, and something I loved about the show is obviously they treat almost Daredevil like Matt's addiction. He's trying to hold off from putting the suit on again. And we have a sprinkling of that Daredevil theme at moments, certain key moments building up to that. So from a storytelling point of view, what was it like for you both to head down that route and to, just sprinkle that theme in until eventually it just builds up and we reach that incredible, obviously, subway fight with Muse that we got in this week's episode?
Yeah, I think really we owe a lot to the writers and the way that they set that up, and it just really was able for us to approach the music in a way with sort of hinting at things as you were saying, and then you feel like the payoff obviously happens, and it's fun. To me, it makes it feel very grounded and very real. When you have Matt, he's sort of struggling with this, the loss of one of his best friends, and should he be Daredevil? Should he not? And then I feel like he's getting pulled back into something, and for better or for worse, it feels very grounded, a lot like, not like I'm a superhero, but in some ways about life. It feels very, very much like what he's struggling with to be who he wants to be. And I think that tension we really wanted to play with in the music, because he's almost at times it feels like he's just sitting there, like even when he's in the courtroom, he's sort of like at church, what I mean? He's sort of internally with himself and his thoughts, and you feel like he's almost haunted by his past. And so it's really fun to play with that, juxtaposition of where he is, and made the theme pay off.
And I think something that was sort of cool was that Taylor came up with this idea to have this solo cello panning left and right to sort of give you a sense of space. And we even sort of recorded the orchestra that way so that we could have some natural panning. But what's fun about it is that you'll hear, and that's sort of part of Matt's theme, but going into Daredevil's theme. So you'll hear hints of like Matt's theme. And, as a viewer, the idea is that like you're hearing that, and you're like, oh, are we going to go there? And it gives you like little teases of like, here we go. And that's sort of a fun thing that we were able to play with that sort of little motif throughout the season, is like give little sprinklings of that, like in moments where you may or may not be leading up to the actual Daredevil, or like you said, Josh, like will he be the addict that says no to that drink, or will he take that drink?
It's such a great theme, and like I said, that subway scene when we finally get, we see Matt running towards Muse, and that music just kicks in as the fight plays out. That must have been a great moment for you both to work on, especially as beyond it being just this badass action scene, it's a huge moment for Daredevil as well, of course, and what we're going to see in the weeks ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's funny because the we discussed with one of the executives about how he's on the phone and he just says fuck it, and like as he goes, you actually don't hear the Daredevil theme yet. You just hear the sort of the building of it, and it's like pulling you in and pulling you in. And he talked about that with us, how he wanted to just like push it as far as we could without playing the theme, because right after the subway comes and it's like it's like the big payoff. So it was very much a conversation.
Yeah, and you have that moment at the end of two where he gets in the fight in the apartment with the police officers, and like you want it to go there, right? And I think what's great about, and this came on the Marvel side and the director side, was like let's go to no music for that fight in episode two, right? Which really pays off nicely with his like rage scream at the end of two. Um, but it plays really nicely into then what happens in six. And Taylor and I are always thinking like, if it's in a film, we're always thinking like, whether you want to feel emotion or feel scared or whatever, thinking about like things that you plant or don't plant and how you get to where you want to be, because it's more of sort of a journey, at least on the music side. Um, and within this, it was like really fun to have that payoff at the end of six and sort of hold out in two, where it's like, nope, not yet. It's really fun.
Yes, it's such a great moment. And I know obviously comic books, they don't have a soundtrack, but for both of you, is it is it useful to look at those for inspiration? I know you've got 3 seasons of Daredevil you can maybe go back and take cues from if you want to, but do the comic books help at all in maybe establishing, the sounds for certain characters and moments like that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think having, I mean, we were already familiar with a lot of comic books from Daredevil and X-Men, so it really helped just sort of being fans. It helps the familiarity with the sort of the franchise, um, and so that definitely is inspiring. But it is nice to go back and be like, uh, look at characters like Stiltman and like different characters that are from the comics. But yeah, it satisfies the inner nerd.
Yeah, and the comics have such a way of like telling a story, as we all know, right? I think that's what draws us in when we're young, right? It's like, wow, it's like this there's like a lot going on, but you're really getting like the details of like little dialogue and the way that you can kind of, I even love like in comics, like, and this is the one thing I don't love about digital, and you could set it up so you can read it this way, but if you're doing it the regular web page style on the iPad with comics, you're only getting like the page, right? What's interesting about like the 2 page of the comics that I kind of miss, because I am doing mostly digital nowadays, is that like there was a little bit of like teasing you on the next page, even if you're like whatever. It's not a lot of story, but sometimes a lot happens in several like, you know, in just one page, and you would sometimes look ahead like, oh, here it comes, oh, here we go, oh yeah, it's coming. So I think that the comics give a lot of inspiration to us in terms of just sort of like a colorful and rich palette of ideas and things that sort of can feed us.
Absolutely. And one of my favorite scenes again so far, obviously seeing John Bernthal come back as the Punisher for that great sequence between him and Matt in his base. And I know I can't get into spoilers, but the trailers have shown we're going to see a little bit more of the Punisher moving forward. How much fun has it been to work on that character and to establish a sound for him as well? Because obviously, again, he's got history, but I feel like this is a new kind of Punisher, particularly with his relationship with Daredevil.
Yeah, I think we talked to the showrunner and the executives about the Punisher specifically, and it was really about again, you see this sort of in the series parallel with certain characters, as you mentioned, sort of this different characters, different versions of them, you could say, a different side of them. And when you see Frank, he's pretty broken. He's pretty he's not in the best shape. He's not physically banged up at this moment, but he's mentally definitely taken a beating. And so is Matt. So to see them both kind of broken, we were able to sort of play with sort of themes and music for that character of sort of Frank, and it's more Frank than the Punisher, really. And so it was a ton of fun to get into that and kind of touch on that the more broken side of Frank. And I'm a huge nerd fan of Frank. I have the Punisher logo on a vintage 1966 Mustang of mine, and it's right on the air filter. And strangely enough, I actually didn't put it there. I bought the car from the guy who built it, and he had a Punisher logo on the car. And I was already a fan, so I was just like, "Oh, this is amazing!" And it made me want the car even more. And I had Dario, the showrunner, sign the logo on it because I'm just such a geek like that, and because he worked on the original Punisher series, and so it was kind of all connecting all the different things. But long story short, you didn't really need to hear that. But yes,
Okay.
it was a definite treat to have Frank come in, and I feel like the fans were really excited, and so were we. So
Yeah, and what's kind of special is that you're catching these two characters in a moment where they both, as Taylor said, like Frank feels broken, and so does Matt, and they're both sort of at odds with each other, but they're wrestling the same problem, but they have I I feel like they've always had a bit of a different take on like what the answer is, and I think that that's really interesting. It's funny too, like the juxtaposition of that conversation with them and the conversation in the diner between Matt and Fisk earlier in the season, right? It's interesting, like yeah, it's interesting how like those conversations go and sort of the vulnerability of people's personalities when they let you know who they are. And it's almost like the reverse, right? The Fisk and Matt Murdock ended with like, well, yeah, yeah, okay, you do what you do and I'll do what I do. And it's like not good. Like this isn't gonna end well. And with Frank and Matt, it ends a little more like, oh, on a different sort of note, but you're still not sure like where they really stand with each other, but they're telling you a lot about who they are in that conversation, which is great.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm glad you mentioned Fisk because, of course, obviously Daredevil and Kingpin in this series, they're on two very divergent kind of paths after that meeting in the diner. So when it comes to obviously the score, do you approach characters like that very differently just because how opposite they are, or because of those parallels with their stories? Do you find similarities that you can put into the score with them?
I think initially we wanted to, obviously the sounds and what describes each character sonically is very different. And I think originally it was sort of like, okay, we're going to build this character and his world and this character. But I think early on, as we were writing, we found that there were parallels and connection, obviously, between the characters that you can see just with the story that's, the episodes that have been released just thus far. And I think that was really, really clever, just again in the writing. And so the music was able to play with that a little bit. And Andy early on and I talked about a theme for sort of Hell's Kitchen, sort of the city, and that music plays actually back and forth between both characters, where it sort of spills into each other, and that was by design, but that wasn't the original intention from our very very early like concepts and sketches. That sort of became that as we were writing, and so it was, which was a treat.
Wow, yeah, that's fascinating. And I know much has been said about obviously the show had a bit of a creative overhaul, which has benefited massively from what everyone has said and what we've seen, because I've been lucky enough to see the whole series and it is just, like I said, amazing. But did anything change for both of you tonally with how you had to approach your music? Did you have to go back and change anything, or was it very much, did you come in after the overhaul to do your work?
We were involved before and after, and I think the overhaul allowed, with the strike, it allowed time for everyone to sort of take time to look at what had been done and figure out like where, what the next iterations of Daredevil and Matt are and were. And I think on our end, I think because Taylor and I have spent so much time with the comic book of it all, even prior to this, that I think in our minds we had a pretty good idea in our heads of where we wanted to live musically. And then of course it just came down to like details, like after, once the strike had ended and everyone sort of got back on board, it was sort of about figuring out what sort of details uh, we needed to sort of adjust on. But for the most part, the details we were getting into didn't really happen until after the strike. So we were really sort of off to the races. And we kind of started down a pretty dark road um, when we first came on. And I feel like we kind of stayed on that dark road of like fury and redemption, sort of like the balance of those two things. We kind of stayed in that world of like, okay, we have some hymns and choir, and then we have like the rage and animosity of the other side of it as well. And that was always sort of we were always sort of on that road on our end.
We tend to write a lot of music early on, given time. If we come on early to a project, we prefer to write a bunch of just ideas, and sometimes one path will lead you to another of discovery. And the creatives on the team are very encouraging to sort of go out and expand and try things, and then they'll listen and give us feedback. So I think helping early on when things did change from the reshoots and the changes, I think it was helpful to have so much stuff because we could kind of make a left or a right turn because we had actually quite a bit to go with. So that I think that helped.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. It all came together great. And going back to the opening credits, I'd love to know how does that process work for you both? Did you have that piece of music obviously done in advance and then they build the credits around that, or is it more of a case they show you some ideas for the credits and then you work around the music, or is that piece of obviously music for Daredevil just something you knew from the start? You just wanted to approach it that way for the series because it is obviously very operatic and very epic, I think, especially compared to the Netflix one.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of both to answer your question. I think we wrote actually a bigger, no one wants main titles for 4 minutes. So we wrote a large version, and then we kind of have a shorter version, and then we based off feedback of what people were liking, we changed things, and then the way they were doing the designs, we saw some early stuff, and then of course as it's changing, it tightens up. But for most of the part, the timings were pretty consistent and the same, and that didn't change really too much, and that allowed us to sort of go back and forth. But from the 4 minute version, once we got that down, it seemed to move like gangbusters.
Yeah.
And it's funny because Taylor and I will often do our initial sort of creative meeting with the team, and then we won't say much to each other. We'll sort of use that opportunity to be like two separate individuals first, and we'll just sort of like go off and like hibernate in our caves and work on music, and then we'll come together and share our ideas. And the one idea that we were sort of unified on, which was hilarious, was like we both had done versions of solo, like vulnerable vocals, like to sort of express Matt. And it was like almost hilarious, like that we hadn't talked, but our sort of main ideas were based around like a solo sort of like haunting vocal. So it's like in moments like that, it kind of is like a reassurance of like, oh, okay, we're on to something that we both feel pretty strongly about. And that gives you a little bit of like confidence in, well, even if no one loves this, like we feel good about it. And it ended up being sort of the right journey to go on, which worked out really well, as Taylor said. And then that kind of really just like blossomed into everything else.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating process, and I'd love to know from both of you as well what the biggest challenges with fight scenes in a show like this. You know, obviously we've got that TVMA rating. It's very violent, gritty. You mentioned before that obviously episode 2 you didn't want to put music in there to kind of let that scene play out the way it did. But what's it been like for you working on those? Because obviously we got that bullseye fight scene in the premiere. We've then got obviously the Muse scene. We've got a lot to come as well in the weeks ahead. But how is it working on the action scenes? And yeah, just how challenging are they with a show like this?
They're not that challenging in terms of the music side of it. I think it's more about you know when to have a certain element like a melody that comes in versus no melody, to allow room for screams and someone suffering or some massive punch. I think it's more about just the sort of the technicality of carving out those moments, and more about what we want to do versus what we don't want to do, what the team wants to do, and so that way it's supporting the project, and not overwhelming certain points would, or and then maybe it does need to overwhelm it in a certain place, and it's playing with those sort of elements, because at the end of the day it's telling the story of what's happening, and in a scene like Muse and Daredevil fighting, it's like I love it when you watch action music and it's not just driving music. It's has something really unique and strange about it. And what's fun about that sequence is that we kind of played with, like, when Muse was kind of maybe getting a little bit of an edge on Daredevil, the music would go into sort of this creepy, weird stuff that he was doing. And then meanwhile, you have Fisk and Adam, that whole sequence going on. And it's so brilliantly edited, cutting back and forth. So we wanted the music to tie in sort of the chaos and what's happening with both fights and Muse. And then of course, then Daredevil needs to have his elements of organ and choir and those kind of things. So those kind of that those all those kind of points to hit is real fun for us, and it's real, especially because you've waited all these episodes for that to arrive. It's almost therapeutic.
Yeah, and the I mean the biggest sort of challenge for us on that end is trying to make those action or fight sequences be unique to the show, um, and also sort of act as they need to within the scene. And a lot of that is just having like lots of trust in the entire team, right? Because I mean, obviously we have some of the sound design when we're working on this stuff, but we don't, what ends up on the final dub stage is like such an incredible like feat of like sound design and music and everything just coming together. And on our end, it's sort of about finding the moments where we think we should sort of be upfront and the moments when we should be out back or not in at all. And it's sort of again just a lot of trust, because like your instincts are like you want to feel a lot of like motion and movement, but that's not actually the answer a lot of the time. It's more about like how does this fit in the scene and making you feel uncomfortable in action with like not having a drive to it, and focusing more on like the thematic elements, as Taylor said, within that scene. And that's really tricky because it's like it doesn't just work. It's almost easier to do a 6-minute scene with dialogue that has wall-to-wall music purposefully, because you can sit down and just play the piano while you watch the scene, and like peaks and valleys and slow down and speed up and let's go to this chord here and this melody here and blah blah blah. But within a fight sequence, there's a lot more happening. And so it's like a lot of like writing, producing, figuring it out. And then you sit back and watch it and you might think it works. And then the next morning you come in and grab your quad espresso and it's like not working, but sometimes it's just like, oh, this needs to move here, that needs to move there. So I think anyway, that's super boring and nerdy, but that's sort of the details of it.
It's interesting because I feel like music is so subjective that what one perceives is maybe necessarily like really big and huge. Someone else doesn't perceive that. it's an interesting situation when because you watch a big action sequence, sometimes the music is small actually or thin, and but because the scene is big and a lot is happening and sound effects, people are like the music is so epic, and you're like, well, there's barely any music in there. So it's finding that that balance. But that scene with music, particularly in Daredevil, there's so much weird stuff happening. We took like a soprano voice and we chopped it up, and so it sounds almost like a stuttering of like a singer, and it's moving, and then there's we took the orchestra and they're playing, and then they just like drop in pitch, and it's just and it sounds like it's almost like bending, and like it's just it was very fun to work with the strange in that scene. Yeah.
Yeah, it's unbelievably how, just to hear that process and how interesting it is. And I know I mentioned X-Men at the start, and that was such a beloved series to bring back. And, the amazing job you guys did with the themes in both in the opening and throughout the show. But does it differ, having now done those superhero projects, does it differ working on animation to what we've seen from Daredevil, or does the genre, is it quite similar in some ways, despite the difference in them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the site, obviously, Daredevil's much darker, and the difference of the just the tone of the shows. But I think the nuances and the details of each show have their own things you have to pay attention to. Like it's a big thing in X-Men in terms of the transition and the size going from really big to really small really quick, because it's almost wall to wall. And it has sort of this theatrics of drama in X-Men that comes so quick, and then on to another story, on another story. And it's different. I feel like in Daredevil, the details and the nuances are much different, and there's a slow burn at times, and like little hints of things here that come up, pay off later, and just very different challenges.
Yeah, and in Daredevil, there's like a little more of a desire to have a hangover of the music, and I mean that I guess in both ways of like a hanging over of the music, but also a hangover, like the lingering effect of it. I guess it's the same thing, but I think the idea is that there's a bit more of like in film, there's a bit more of fluidity to it all, and there's like even when you're transitioning to a much different scene, you can have an abrupt cutoff, but oftentimes it's nice to like have like a smooth landing as opposed to like the plane landing you have when you land in Lake Tahoe, and it's just like you're going from 10,000 feet to like lake level in seconds. So I think that like it is much different in that way, and I think in the Daredevil of it all, it's there's a lot to be said about teeing up where you're going later in the episode and even in the season, right? Um, and it makes it tricky. It makes it necessary for us to sort of self-produce ourselves internally, where we've written something that's like, oh yeah, this works great, but oftentimes you need a minute, like a day, 2 days, to figure out like, oh, it needs some adjusting because it feels too forced or whatever. Anyway, yeah, on and on. I could just keep going.
That's awesome. And just finally, I've got to ask, I'm sure there's pretty much nothing you can say, but have you both started thinking about obviously X-Men 97 season 2 and Daredevil Born Again season 2? Because I know they're both in production. Have you been given any thoughts to what we might hear from you in those?
We don't
Uh,
have any no, we don't have anything on those just yet, but we will soon.
I will say, we're always thinking about it too. We're always thinking about, you know,
Yeah.
and that's the fun about it. I mean, I think when we finished X-Men '97, I was thinking about, I didn't even know what was coming, but I was thinking about what was going to happen musically. So it's all you're always thinking about
Yeah, I'm just going to put it out there. I think Marvel Studios needs to get you for the X-Men, the live action reboot they're doing, because we need that theme back in a different way, I think, in live action too.
Oh, thanks,
Oh
Josh.
man. Thanks a lot, Josh. Yeah, thank you. That's yeah, man. Thank you for that.
It's been a pleasure, though. Thank you both so much, Taylor and Andy, for being so generous with your time to talk about the show. Because, as I said, to me, it's a masterpiece, and what you guys have done is masterpiece as well. And I cannot wait to sit down. I think the soundtrack is the first volume coming out this week that we'll be able to listen to. So, yes,
Tomorrow. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
cannot wait for that. But no, thank you both so much. It's been awesome to meet you and to talk to you.
Well, thanks so
No,
much.
thank you, Josh. Really loved meeting you and chatting with you, man. Thank you
Hope we can do it again. Thanks so much, guys. Have a great
for
day.
sure.
Okay.
Thank you, you too. Bye bye.
Bye
Thanks.
bye.